They found them buried 5 feet under an Indiana cornfield. 2 brothers, stripped to their underwear, bodies bruised from head to ankle, faces so disfigured that fingerprints were needed for identification. Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro and his younger brother Michael had been beaten with such savage brutality that blood filled their lungs and airways until they couldn't breathe. The farmer who discovered them thought he'd stumbled upon a poached deer. Instead, he'd uncovered one of the mob's most notorious executions. But the truth of how they got there, and why, is far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. What really happened in those final hours? Stick around, because this story has secrets that took 20 years to surface. On June 14, 1986, Tony Spilotro and his brother Michael drove away from Michael's Oak Park home in a Lincoln, telling family they'd be back in a few hours. They never returned. What the brothers didn't know was that they were driving to their own execution, lured by a lie so convincing that even Tony, Chicago's most paranoid enforcer, believed it. The brothers thought they were headed to a ceremony where Michael would finally be made, inducted as a full member of the Chicago outfit, and Tony would be promoted to capo. Instead, they were being summoned to answer for sins that had made them expendable. For 15 years, Tony Spilotro had ruled Las Vegas like a king of darkness. The FBI suspected him of at least 22 murders, though he'd never been convicted of a single one. His signature style was psychological terror mixed with creative brutality. In one of his most infamous killings, witnesses claimed he tortured a victim by putting his head in a vise until his eyeballs popped out. This wasn't just violence. This was theater, and it earned him a reputation that made grown men shake with fear. But Tony didn't start out as a monster. Born on May 19, 1938, in Chicago to Italian immigrants who ran Patsy's restaurant, young Anthony grew up watching mobsters conduct business in his family's parking lot. His father's restaurant was a regular hangout for organized crime figures, and by the time he was a teenager, Tony and his brothers were already stealing, shoplifting, and learning the ways of the Chicago underworld. When his father died suddenly in 1954, leaving his mother to raise 6 sons alone, Tony dropped out of high school and fully embraced the criminal life. By 1962, Tony had befriended key members of the Chicago outfit, including notorious mob boss Joseph Aiuppa, known as Joey Doves. He joined the crew of Mad Sam DeStefano, a sadistic killer whose violence was so unpredictable that even other mobsters feared him. Under DeStefano's guidance, Tony earned his bones by torturing and killing Billy McCarthy and James Maraglia, 2 young burglars who'd made the fatal mistake of killing 2 thieves in a neighborhood where Chicago crime bosses lived. The bodies were found in a car trunk. McCarthy's head had been placed in a vise and his throat slashed. This became known as the M&M murders, and it was Tony's ticket into the big leagues. In 1963, at just 25 years old, Tony Spilotro became a made man in the Chicago outfit. 8 years later, in 1971, the bosses sent him to Las Vegas with a specific mission: protect the skim. 4 major casinos, the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina, were controlled by the outfit, and millions of dollars in cash profits were being illegally diverted straight to mob coffers in Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. Tony's job was simple: keep the money flowing and make sure nobody interfered. But Tony Spilotro was never content with simple. Bored with his role as glorified security for the skim operation, he decided to build his own criminal empire in Vegas. In 1976, he opened a jewelry and electronics store called the Gold Rush, 1 block off the Vegas Strip. It wasn't just a legitimate business, it was the headquarters for what would become one of the most infamous burglary crews in American crime history, the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang. The name came from their signature method. If they couldn't find an easy entry point into wealthy homes, hotel rooms, or high-end stores, they'd simply drill through walls or ceilings to get what they wanted. The crew included some of Vegas's most skilled thieves, and even a corrupt Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officer, Joe Blasco, who acted as lookout. Tony's childhood friend Frank Culotta ran operations under Tony's watchful eye, and together they stole millions in jewelry, furs, cash, and anything else of value. By the mid-1970s, Tony was living large. He bought extensive properties around Las Vegas, drove expensive cars, and maintained a visible lifestyle that was everything a mob enforcer shouldn't be. The whole point of his job was to stay in the shadows, but Tony craved the spotlight. In 1978, Nevada's Gaming Commission blacklisted him, banning him from entering any casino in the state. The very casinos he was sent to protect were now off-limits to him. It was a humiliation that should have been a warning. And the warnings kept coming. By 1981, law enforcement had built a massive task force dedicated solely to taking down Spilotro and his crew. They knew every hangout, every associate, every pattern. On the night of July 4th, 1981, the Hole-in-the-Wall gang planned their biggest score yet, a burglary of Bertha's gifts and home furnishings on East Sahara Avenue. They believed the vault contained at least $1.5 million in cash and jewelry. Frank Culotta later admitted he didn't trust one of the crew members, Sal Romano, suspecting he was an FBI informant. He warned Tony, but Tony brushed off his concerns. They should have listened. When the crew climbed onto the roof and drilled down into the store, they walked straight into a trap. Police surrounded the building, and most of the gang was arrested on the spot. Culotta, watching from his car, managed to escape, but the damage was done. The feds had their opening, and they used it to flip several crew members, including Romano, who had indeed been an informant all along. Frank Culotta soon learned something that terrified him. Wiretaps had captured Tony, talking about, quote, cleaning our dirty laundry. Culotta, who'd been Tony's friend since childhood, realized Tony was planning to kill him. In July 1982, Culotta made a deal with prosecutors and entered the Witness Protection Program. His testimony would become one of the nails in Tony's coffin. At trial in October 1983, Culotta confessed to being involved in over 300 crimes, including 4 murders. He testified that Tony had ordered him to kill their former friend Sherwin Jerry Lisner in 1979 because Lisner was suspected of being an informant. He revealed that Tony was taking a cut from every burglary and robbery in Las Vegas, something Tony had explicitly told him to keep secret from the bosses back in Chicago. The revelation was explosive. Tony had been skimming from the skim. But Tony's legal troubles weren't his only problem. His personal life was becoming equally toxic. For years, rumors had circulated about an affair between Tony and Gary McGee Rosenthal, the beautiful but troubled wife of Frank Lefty Rosenthal, who managed the Stardust Casino for the mob. Lefty and Tony had been childhood friends in Chicago, and Tony was supposed to be Lefty's protector in Vegas. Instead, the FBI had evidence of the affair from extensive wiretaps. They deliberately leaked the story to newspapers across America, ensuring that even if the Chicago bosses wanted to look away, they couldn't. The affair was catastrophic for multiple reasons. It violated one of the mob's cardinal rules: never sleep with another made man's wife. It created unwanted media attention at a time when law enforcement was already closing in. And it made Tony look reckless, disloyal, and uncontrollable. Gary eventually confessed the affair to her husband. Lefty warned her not to tell Tony that he knew because he feared Tony would kill them both. The marriage disintegrated. Gary spiraled into deeper drug addiction and died of an apparent overdose in Los Angeles in 1982. That same year, on October 4th, someone planted a bomb under Frank Rosenthal's Cadillac Eldorado outside Tony Roma's restaurant on East Sahara Avenue. When Lefty turned the ignition key, the car exploded. 3-inch flames shot through the dashboard vents, but Lefty survived, saved by a quirk of engineering, a steel plate under the driver's seat that diverted the blast upward and backward instead of forward. He staggered from the burning wreckage, hair standing on end, yelling, "They're trying to kill me!" No one was ever charged, but many suspected Tony's involvement. Back in Chicago, the bosses were losing patience. In January 1986, most of the Chicago outfit's upper echelon gathered at the Czech Lodge in North Riverside, Illinois for a critical meeting. Joseph Ayupa and John Cerrone had just been convicted of skimming charges and were headed to prison. Mob boss Tony Joe Batters Accardo appointed Samuel Carlisi as the new street boss, and then turned to the first order of business, the Tony Spilotro problem. 5 of Tony's underlings had turned government witnesses. 3 had testified against Ayupa, Cerrone, and other top bosses. Tony's affair with Gary Rosenthal had become a public scandal. His hole-in-the-wall gang had been busted. He was facing multiple criminal trials. He'd stopped generating money for the outfit and had started creating nothing but problems. Mob enforcer Rocco Infelice said it plainly. Hit him. Everyone at the meeting agreed. The plot was set in motion. But there was a complication. Michael Spilotro, Tony's younger brother who owned a restaurant called Hoagie's in Chicago. Michael wasn't a made man, but he was connected to the outfit and had his own legal troubles. More importantly, Michael and Tony were close. If they killed Tony, Michael would seek revenge. The solution was simple and brutal. Kill them both. Here's where the story gets truly chilling. The brothers were lured to their deaths with the promise of glory. They were told to come to Chicago for a ceremony. Michael would finally be inducted as a made member. Tony would be promoted to capo, a significant elevation in the mob hierarchy. For men who dedicated their lives to the outfit, this was the ultimate honor. Even Tony, who'd survived decades in the mob by being paranoid and ruthless, believed it. On June 14th, the brothers drove to what they thought was their coronation. Jimmy Marcello picked them up and drove them to a house in Bensonville, Illinois. As they descended into the basement, reality crashed down on them. Waiting below weren't mob bosses ready to celebrate. Waiting below was a death squad. According to Nicholas Calabrese, who later became a government informant and testified about the murders in 2007, the basement was packed with top mob figures, all waiting to deliver the message. This wasn't just an execution. It was a statement. Louis the Mooch Ebely was there. Other bosses made a point of showing up to get their own hits in before the brothers died. The plan was simple but vicious. Tackle them, hold them down, and strangle them. Calabrese testified that he dove at Michael's legs, grabbed him, and held him while another mobster strangled him with a rope. Tony, realizing what was happening, made one final request that would haunt everyone who heard it. According to court testimony, Tony Spilotro asked his executioners, "Can I say a prayer?" There was no reply, no mercy, no absolution. The beatings that followed were savage beyond comprehension. Forensic pathologist Drive. John Pless, who performed the autopsies, determined that the brothers died from multiple blunt trauma injuries to the head, neck, and chest, most likely from punches and kicks rather than baseball bats, as depicted in the movie Casino. Their injuries were so severe that blood filled their lungs and airways, causing them to asphyxiate. The coroner later stated the brothers had been beaten from head to ankle. But here's one of the most disturbing details that didn't emerge until years later. There's evidence suggesting the brothers may have still been alive when they were buried. After the beatings, John Feccarata and others drove the bodies to a cornfield on the outskirts of Enos, Indiana, about 60 miles from Chicago, and buried them under 5 feet of earth. The location wasn't random. The cornfield was near a farm once owned by Joseph Ayupa himself, the very boss Tony had served and ultimately betrayed. It was one final insult. Tony Spilotro, Vegas's most feared enforcer, would spend eternity in the dirt of his boss's backyard. For 9 days, the brothers were missing. Michael's wife, Ann, reported them missing on June 16th, after their Lincoln was found abandoned in a motel parking lot near O'Hare International Airport. On June 22nd, a farmer working his field near Enos noticed freshly turned earth. Thinking a poacher had buried a deer killed out of season, he called authorities. What they found instead were 2 bodies, one on top of the other, stripped to their underwear, buried in a shallow grave. The discovery made headlines across America. The bodies were so badly damaged that dental charts from their brother Patrick, who was a dentist, were needed to confirm their identities. Tony was 48 years old. Michael was 41. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma, and the coroner determined they'd been dead since June 14th, the very day they'd driven away from Michael's house. At Tony's funeral, his attorney, Oscar Goodman, noticed something telling. Several outfit bosses for whom Spilotro had worked were conspicuously absent. Goodman later wrote in his memoir that this absence told him everything he needed to know about who ordered the hit, but it would be 19 years before anyone was held accountable. In 1987, just a year after the murders, John Ficarrata was killed by the mob for bungling the burial of the Spilotro brothers. His sloppy work had allowed the bodies to be discovered when they should have stayed hidden forever. The farmer's sharp eyes had turned what should have been a perfect mob hit into a very public embarrassment. The truth remained buried almost as deep as the brothers themselves until 2005, when the FBI launched Operation Family Secrets, targeting 14 members and associates of the Chicago outfit for 18 murders, including the Spilotros. The key witness was Nicholas Calabrese, who'd participated in the murders and finally decided to cooperate with authorities. At trial in 2007, 21 years after the murders, the full horror of what happened in that Bensonville basement finally came to light. Calabrese testified about how the brothers were ambushed, how Tony asked to pray, how they were beaten to death and dumped in the cornfield. James Marcello, a top outfit figure, was found guilty of the Spilotro murders and sentenced to life in prison. Albert Tonko had already been sentenced to 200 years in 1990 after his wife testified that he told her about burying bodies in an Indiana cornfield. But even with convictions secured, mysteries remain. In a 2010 interview with Maxim magazine, Tony's son Vincent made a startling claim. The real target wasn't his father at all. According to Vincent, Michael was the primary target, and Tony was killed simply to prevent revenge. This theory has never been proven, and most mob historians dismiss it, but it adds another layer of intrigue to an already complex story. Tony's widow, Nancy, who'd married him in 1960 when both were young, retreated into a reclusive life after his death. Their adopted son, Vincent, has spent years trying to humanize his father's legacy, sharing family photos of Tony playing Santa Claus at Christmas, attending Vincent's Little League games, taking the family to Disneyland. Vincent insists his father, despite everything, was just a man who got caught up in things he shouldn't have. It's a generous interpretation for a man the FBI suspected of at least 24 murders. The Bensonville house, where the brothers were killed, has never been officially identified, despite decades of speculation and investigation. Various homes in the area have been suspected, investigated, and cleared. Property records have been examined. Current and former homeowners have been interviewed. But the exact location of that basement chamber of horrors remains, to this day, one of the mob's last family secrets. Tony Spilotro's death marked the end of an era. He was the last of the old-school mob enforcers in Las Vegas, a man who believed violence was not just a tool, but an art form. His death signaled the end of the mob's 40-year stranglehold on Vegas casinos. The skim was over. Federal and state authorities had won. Corporate America was about to transform Las Vegas from a mob playground into a family-friendly entertainment destination. The story of Tony Spilotro has been immortalized in popular culture. Martin Scorsese's 1995 film Casino depicted his life and death, with Joe Pesci playing Nicky Santoro, a character clearly based on Tony. The film shows the brothers being beaten with baseball bats and buried alive in an Indiana cornfield, but according to actual court testimony, this Hollywood version wasn't quite accurate. They weren't killed in the cornfield. They were killed in that suburban basement, then transported to their final resting place. Frank Collada, Tony's childhood friend who betrayed him to save his own life, spent years after his release from witness protection working as a technical consultant on mob films and giving tours of Las Vegas mob history. Before his death from COVID-19 in 2020, he reflected on Tony's final moments. Tony had once told Collada that if you said a prayer before you died and asked God for forgiveness, you wouldn't go to hell. Collada wondered if Tony, in those final terrifying seconds in that basement, actually believed he'd be saved. He was punch drunk, Collada said, implying Tony's judgment had become fatally flawed. What remains undeniable is that Tony Spilotro lived by violence and died by it. He built an empire on fear, torture, and brutality, and when he became more liability than asset, the same organization he'd served eliminated him with the same cold efficiency he'd once used on others. There was a cruel poetry to his end. The man who'd terrified Las Vegas for 15 years, who'd put victims' heads in vices and made them beg for death, died begging to say a prayer that was never answered. The cornfield where the Spilotro brothers were buried is still there, still visible to anyone who knows where to look. 38 years after their bodies were discovered, the turned earth where they lay remains a monument to the mob's capacity for betrayal and violence. It's a reminder that in organized crime, loyalty is conditional, friendship is expendable, and even the most feared enforcers can become victims when they outlive their usefulness. Tony Spilotro believed he was untouchable. He believed his violence and reputation would protect him. He believed the promise of a promotion. He died believing he might still have a chance to pray for salvation. He was wrong on every count. In the end, Vegas's most feared mobster met his fate not in a blaze of glory, but in a suburban basement, stripped of his clothes and his dignity, beaten to death by the very organization he'd killed for, and buried like garbage in someone else's backyard. That's the truth about Tony the Ant Spilotro, and now you know the whole story.